Hey, everybody, welcome to another film career panel. Today we are talking about how to be a good producer, and we have as our panelists Matt Blick and David Cook today. Let me get these guys out of here. There we go. Matt Blick and David Cook. And again, I'm John Clay Burnett, and Andrew Bartlett is helping co-host. This is part of Motion University team bringing you the panel here today. So I'm going to get started off with, why don't we have David give us a quick introduction and some of your history and some of the projects you've worked on and who you are as a producer.
Well, it's great to be with you guys today, and it's actually tonight for me. I'm currently in Mongolia, but 1 a.m. here right now. So I'm glad to be able to use the internet to do these fun calls. I've been working on film since 2009, and I guess I just like everything logistics, so producing definitely falls into that. Been able to produce 5 or 6 features, worked in other capacities, locations, AD, so just anything that has planning or money is great. And recently got to work on a film in Mongolia, and also worked on Overcomer last year, which is in theaters this weekend. So that's me in 60 seconds, maybe.
Cool. Thank you, David. And David's coming to us on this one from an international time zone. So thank you, David, for even taking some crazy time slots here to fit this in. Matt, go ahead and give us a quick introduction and who you are as a producer and some projects you've worked on.
Sure. Hey, guys. John, Clay, and Andrew, thanks again for having me on as well. A little bit about myself. So I've been in what I would consider the corporate filmmaking world for the last 15 years. And of course, over that time, things have changed a lot in terms of my roles, in terms of what I do. But now the last few years, I solely do producing, directing, and I do creative directing as well. And so I've worked with clients in the corporate space. I'm a little bit different in that regard, but I've worked with Fortune 500 companies. I've worked with people like PayPal, Han Furniture. I've worked with Four Seasons, just many other. Abbott Labs is a medical client that I have, just doing content for them on a corporate space. So, of course, my experience in terms of as we talk will be in a different environment. So hopefully that will give some unique perspectives for your audience as we're talking.
Yeah, for sure. No, it's nice. It's really cool to have some different perspectives on that, coming from 2 different spheres, kind of, but also kind of the same principles may apply. So I'm curious to dig into this and see what some of the thoughts are to some of the questions. Has some good questions submitted for this panel, and anybody watching live, feel free to drop questions in the comments and we will get those included as we can. To start with, Andrew, I think we want to talk about, our first question is, what are some important qualities for a producer to have? What are some of the important qualities, kind of big picture, for a producer? I heard David say detailed and organized in spreadsheets. Maybe that's a start, but thoughts on important qualities to be a good producer.
So, okay, I'll jump in here. So in terms of where my experience comes from, definitely you have to be a detailed oriented person. You have to love the business side of production. You can have a creative bone in you, but you have to love how to run a business. You have to know your numbers. If you don't know your numbers, you're going to fail as a producer because, one, as David knows too, you're in charge of the budget. And if you don't know your numbers, if you don't know where you're at in terms of budgets, one, in terms of what I do, you're gonna you're gonna tick off your client. So you have to know where things are at, but also not only that, but say you hit your numbers, say your client's happy. If you don't understand where you are within your own budget, your business may fail because you're not making a profit. So in terms of the corporate space, that's key. But you also have to be conversational. You have to know how to work with people and how to manage them. And I know David would have that same experience, just in terms of, yes, you have a lot of just, business and numbers that you're dealing with, and you're doing a lot more office work and administrative side of things. But you have to know how to work with people, how to manage them.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I would also say, there's some other kinds of things that come up once you get going, like being a problem solver. I would say a producer, in one word, is kind of a facilitator. You're not doing most of the creative work, as Matt said, although I sometimes say that we have to be creative with the budget or other things. But really, you're there to facilitate everyone else doing what they're trying to do. So it's really I think of it as a service kind of oriented role. And it's part of what I enjoy. I enjoy just trying to help everybody else set them up for success and see them do well.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about, Matt was even mentioning part of it is being able to manage people. Is it a good idea to be one of the questions that came in was, is it a good idea to be both a director and a producer? How does that work, and where does that start to fall apart?
Say, sure. I would say it depends on the type of project you're on. David's on a completely different, he's in a different ball game in terms of his features that he works on. In the corporate space, a lot of projects I work on are smaller crews. And so many times the producer is the director as well. And I mean, sometimes you get on projects where it's 2 people, but I work on, a crew that's a couple people. And so what I do is typically I'm a producer and director. And so it's just a matter of, you have to understand your roles. You have to understand what is required of you, but also be willing to hire the right people. I know that leads into another conversation we'll have here soon, but hiring the right type of people that can take on the other roles that you need done, so that you can succeed on the producing and directing side.
Yeah, I definitely, if you're doing something larger scale, those roles are not going to be very compatible, because you're kind of pulled in 2 different directions completely. But one of the definitions I've heard for a producer is you do whatever you don't hire somebody else to do. So each project's different, each situation's different. But I think if you start to really get a feel for that, then it gives you an idea of what your responsibilities are.
Yeah, and maybe we should back up real quick and define a producer from your guys' perspective, just to make sure that even with everybody watching and stuff, that we're all on the same page, using the same technology. In your guys' minds, real quick, how would you define a producer, and what do they basically cover on a project?
You want to start, David?
Sure. I think Matt covered some of that already. So usually you're doing whatever you don't hire somebody else to do.
That's so true.
Usually that means you're doing a lot of things at the front end because you haven't hired people yet. As you bring people on, you start doing more specific things. So you have to kind of figure out the project, figure out what you need, and then start bringing those pieces together. And that includes figuring out the budget, what you have to work with or what you need to be able to do the job, and then what other assets you need to bring to the table. And I think that it really starts there. And then, if you're working on a commercial or you're working on a feature, there's a lot of different directions that goes. Eventually, you end up doing real practical stuff. You're hiring the people you need, managing the budget, keeping track of things, and just problem solving is usually what I end up doing.
I would add to that, and this is something I thought in terms of, what are you looking for in a producer in terms of traits? You're the leader. The buck stops with you. The responsibility stops with you, or it ends with you. And so you have to cast the vision. And I understand, like on a feature, that's what the director does. But in the corporate space, when you are a producer director combination role, you have to cast the vision. You can't expect your DP to understand what the client needs, because you've had multiple conversations beforehand with the client to figure out, okay, let's work through your script. Let's pick out location. Let's figure out how you want to describe your service or your product. And so you have to be the one that not only takes initiative, but you also have to be willing to cast the vision, not only for your crew, because, you know, your gaffer needs to know how to light for the scene. You know, your DP needs to know, okay, yes, we're shooting X or Y, but why are we shooting it? You know, how does this play into the whole story and what we're trying to tell here? So you have to, as the producer, yes, you have that analytical mind and that kind of planning aspect, but you also have to be able to understand and know how to cast a vision to your clients, because they're hiring you as a professional, but also to your crew. So that would be one thing that I'd throw in there too, is that if you're the type of person that is not that kind of A-type personality, or just doesn't know how to cast a vision, it can be a struggle of a position to be in. If that makes sense.
I love what you're saying. If I could just add one thing kind of off of that, even if you're not in the position to need to cast the creative side, you still set the tone in many ways by how you handle yourself, how you respond to things. I like to act and not react. That means thinking ahead about things that might go wrong and figuring out solutions for them. Just keeping your cool, being calm, and really responding in the right way really helps people feel safe when they're working with you. And that in turn allows them to do their best creatively. So definitely totally agree with you there. And just, you know, it's important how you carry yourself and how you respond to things.
Correct. Well, one way to look at this too is that if you look at it as more just a business, you're the CEO in the end. You know, with what David does with, say, if you're on a much larger, you know, agency shoot, as a producer, you're the CEO. I know that's a generalization, because there's many different aspects that go on in terms of planning and accounting and all other stuff that you have to do. But you really are the leader. You're steering the ship, and you know, you have to get schedules out there, you know, just like Dave was talking about, thinking ahead. You have to get schedules out so your crew knows where you're going. You have to, you know, line up, say, if you got flights and hotels and, you know, all those different aspects that nobody considers, you know, for a shoot to make it happen. There's so many little details that you have to manage, and that it's, you know, the buck stops with you. So you have to be on top of your game and making sure that, like David said, you're thinking ahead. You're making sure that you're not just reacting on set. And there are times, going back to what David said in terms of, you know, in terms of problem solving, because it happens all the time on shoots, all the time. But as a good producer, your job is to mitigate as many of those problems as possible. So there's a foundation in place so that once you do hit the ground running, everyone understands, you know, where their baseline is. You know, things can change. You're going to have ups and downs. Things will be like, hey, oh, we no longer have this piece of equipment. Or, you know, I had a project where the client was like, oh, by the way, that location that we were going to do everything in, we no longer have it. And so we have to go find something else today. And you're shooting today. Okay. So, you know, you run into things like that as a producer.
One question I think that I'd put out to you guys too is, I feel like, especially for those of us in like more the, like you said, like the client side of things too, at what point should someone as the director hire a producer? So often, like so say I'm the one who got the project, maybe my skill set is really in more of the creative, and so this is like basically explaining me. I don't have the skill set in the producing side. Schedules, logistics, all of that stuff is really not my strong point. So for me to be able to focus on the creative and do that and be like directing the project and that kind of thing is super helpful for me to zone in on that. So at what point should someone hire a producer to help manage all of that side of things? Or like, I don't know if you have any thoughts or wisdom for people on where they feel kind of overwhelmed with trying to manage all of that, and just thoughts on like when is a good time to hire a producer.
I would say, go ahead, David.
That's all right. Go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say, it's very important. I've seen guys do this in the past where, you know, they're shooting high-end commercials with agencies, you know, or it's just a very large budget they're working with, and you've got a large crew of individuals that you cannot do producing and directing at the same time, especially on a film set. So, you know, I've seen guys where, you know, the film shoot is in LA or the film shoot is in, Atlanta, and they're not from that location. That goes into our another question that we have later on. But they'll hire a producer from that area because that guy has all the connections. He knows, okay, you need this type of location. I know I've got 5 options for you. I know exactly where to go for this. And it streamlines everything and allows you to be more efficient in your planning. And to your point, Andrew, if you don't have that knack for being able to produce, that type of an individual is a huge asset for you in terms of taking on that workload and being able to just run with the ball in terms of the producing side. So I've seen it happen on larger productions.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to take into account your budget as well. What do you have available? What's your timing look like? How quickly do you need to turn something around? Is it something that you can, waddle through even though it's not your strong suit? Or is it something so if your timeline is short, you definitely want to bring somebody on to help you quickly so that you can really turn that around. Many times you might even be able to bring that producer on during your pre-pro time, even if you can't afford to keep them on. Get all the pieces set up the dominoes, push the first one, and you might not even need to keep them all the way through. So I would say if you're on a tight budget, consider when is the best time, not just when to hire them, but like what window within your project do you need them.
That's excellent.
We had another question submitted. What are some thoughts about the line between an AD and a producer? Because there's managerial, there's some logistics, there's scheduling stuff. Where's the overlap and where's the line between what an AD does and a producer? David, let's start with you.
Well, on a feature film scenario or short film scenario, I would say that the producer and AD, during your planning phase, they're working closely together. But once you get into production, it's almost like 2 sides of a coin. Your AD is in charge of logistics on set. Your producer's in charge of logistics offset. It's not 100% accurate, but it's kind of that concept. So usually that's where I would say the line is. You work together to figure out the best plan. And then once you get into production, really it becomes a question of time and budget. So if the AD knows that he's going to have to go over, he's going to need to talk with the producer to know if they can afford to, or to know how that impacts things, to know if they can, that kind of thing. So that's the interaction once you get into production. I've only worked on a few commercials, but I can definitely see how a producer / AD role could very easily happen in that scenario. Yeah. But I won't try to speak to that as much because that's not my strong suit.
Yep. No, David gave a lot of good information, and yes, usually on commercials, of course, and I'm not speaking when you're doing commercials with 50 to 60 crew members like that's I've only been on sets like that in different scenarios, but in terms of typically what I do with corporate work, I've in the same type of size crew sizes, the producer is that producer AD type person, so you're taking care of all the logistics on site and off site, just like David was talking about. And I really like the details he went into there from the feature perspective, because that is a different ball game. And there is a large benefit to having that type of individual. Going back to budgets, if you can afford it, but I know probably Andrew and John Clay, your audience is watching. They don't have those type of budgets. And so, they're probably dealing with crew sizes, I would guess 5 to 2 people on set. And so a producer can handle all of those logistics just fine. You're typically going and you're shooting a day with a couple interviews and B-roll, and then you're done. You may travel somewhere and shoot for 2 days or whatever, that kind of thing. So you don't need a producer and an AD.
Do you guys ever run into tension with the creative, codename the director, who's trying to get a project made, and you're working on the logistics and numbers and deadlines? How do you either, I don't want to say avoid, because that would seem that you're trying to get around something that exists, but what are some tips you have for approaching to help minimize that kind of tension? Or if you're dealing with it, how do you deal with it?
Are you speaking to if the director's impatient, or?
No, I'm thinking more of like a director who has a vision of the project they're trying to create. And like you say, when things aren't going according to what is seen as needed, or a lot of times directors will want to push longer, or they want to spend more money, or like they have a vision that they're trying to accomplish. When that vision starts to bump up against what the producer's in charge of keeping track of, which is a little bit, again, some of the AD/producer thing of like schedules and money, or resources. What is there things you can do in pre-production to help minimize that tension that can happen, or when you have that tension of something needing to be done? From a producer's perspective, how can you address a director or the creative who is frustrated that what they think they need is not available to them? Or do you ever run into that at all?
David, you want to speak to this?
Yeah. So I have a way I like to handle this situation. I try to remind myself that I'm there to facilitate them accomplishing their job. So I don't view it as a conflict where we're going at each other. And so instead, I try to phrase the situation where we're on the same side and give them a little bit of the creative control to make the best decision based on the variables we have. So I'll give a concrete example. You're on set, you've got 2 hours of daylight left. Based on the speed that you're filming, you know you need 4 hours. At that point, as a AD/producer, I will talk with the director and DP or the same person or whatever the situation is and say, hey, let's just take 2 minutes here, think through this. What do we want to prioritize? How much time do you want to spend on these shots here? Because we only have about 2 hours of daylight, and I know you want to get all of this. So what's more important to you, to get this right here really well, or to make sure we get everything? So I don't try to be the enforcer. I try to be the facilitator to help them achieve what they need to achieve. And the same goes with budget or anything else. You say, well, I would love to do that. This is how much money we actually have. So where do you want to spend it? Because we can spend it here or we can spend it there. So I kind of have a good understanding of what the logistics are, what the variables are, and then I pose that back to them and try to get them involved in the conversation.
That's really good.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
No. Go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say you're also kind of like the parent on set. You're wrangling all the kids, and they just want to have fun and play, and you're like, no, guys, we've got 2 hours. That's it. I've been on sets where the AD was just like, we're done. You got the shot. We have to move on. Like sometimes you have to be tough. I don't have that kind of scenario in my shoots because it's the corporate world, and yes, you have times where you want to shoot things over and over, but I would say probably David has a lot more experience when it comes to the feature side in dealing with that.
Yeah, so knowing the resources you have available sounds helpful. I'm also hearing this could be dangerous for a director to also want to be their own producer, unless that might be a rare occasion where someone can keep track of both of those things. But it seems ideal if you have a creative, you need someone to help manage some of the logistics and keep them reminded of what the limitations are, and then work together to do the best with what you can. I in one feature film that I worked on, the producer often just walked around on set with a cup of coffee and was just like, let's make a movie. Let's make some movie. And that was like, you talk about the parent on set, that he had hired all the good people to do all the work, and he was just kind of overseeing and managing. And when issues came up, if it had to come back up to him, that was fine. But he was there to kind of make sure everything was produced, and they had a movie at the end of the day. Andrew, what are some other...
Here, I got another comment here. I would say,
sure.
Give an example of where it would have been beneficial to have separated roles, or at least have an AD on set. I had a shoot a couple years ago where we were shooting for an agency. We had a video village. We had the client back there with, 2 people from the agency, and I was directing and producing the spot. And we had a blast on set, but what I would have loved to have done is if I had a director in place who was there with the crew, he was, directing the crew and directing the shoot, and then I could sit back and I could talk with the client, I could talk with the agency, because I was working with them in pre-pro from the very beginning, And, you know, I could sit there and be able to like, okay, guys, we got that shot. We can move on. We've talked about this in pre-pro, you know, just things like that, and being able to kind of manage the client. It would have been a much more efficient, I would say, in that shoot if I would have been more of just that producer role. So that would be an example of where, you know, there are times where it is very helpful to have those roles separated. You know, there's times we can get away with doing both. But when you have that type of a dynamic where you've got the client and the agency there, you don't want to let them just sit off on their own and be like, okay, we're just, you know, we're waiting for Matt and his crew to kind of kick things in gear, you know. And as a producer, you can't just think creative. You also, like, you're managing the project, and we've been talking about this, but you also have to manage client expectations, and that even also means on set. It's not just in emails, it's not just in phone calls, but it's also on set. And so, you know, they're going to have questions that come up. Well, you know, why are we saying this, you know, this exact way within the script? Or, you know, why are we pointing the camera this way? Because it's not, for whatever reason, they always have questions on set, you know. And it would have been beneficial to have those roles separated so that I could just manage the client and their expectations. So that would be an example of why you should have someone like that.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Cool. We have Hannah asked a question on Facebook, which I thought was a really good question just on the live chat here. And so she was wondering, what are some tips on being intentional and knowing how to solve problems in pre-production? For example, what are some things to think ahead of time that you may not even know could be a problem? So I don't know, David, if you want to tackle that one first.
Sure. Well, I think it depends a lot on the situation. So obviously, if you're outdoors, you have to think about weather. If you're in an area that's very loud, you have to think about the sound. You know, so there's a lot of variables just depending on your location or your situation. I was working on a commercial with GE, and we had helicopters and trains and cars all supposed to be working together. So at that point, you know, you think a lot about lockups for the 2-mile section and how long does it take a train to reset, and just a lot of different pieces. So refueling. So I think you just try to think through every aspect of the day, try to identify problem points, things that you think might create a problem or might not work out, and then try to think about what you can do to fix it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I would add too, though, you know, in terms of, I'm thinking other than what David said already. I mean, that's a great example. I'm thinking just in terms of basic logistics. You know, okay, where's my crew staying? You know, how are they going to be provided for? Where's transportation? You know, how am I getting them there? How am I wrapping the project up? What if, you know, because as David would attest to this, and I mean, you guys have done enough shoots too. You've done enough projects that you understand these are the fires that could come up, and these are the issues that we might run into. So you kind of have a mental template, or even a actual physical template of things to go through. You know, a mental checklist of, okay, here are the different aspects I need to take care of to make sure that things, you know, are running smoothly. You know, and, you know, another thing too is just a matter of, you know, I've had thoughts where I'm just like, okay, who's in charge of DIT? You know, I've had creatives show up on set and they're like, oh, I don't have a card reader. You're like, wait, what? It's like, it's a good thing I brought mine. I mean, I'm the producer here, but, you know, I mean, like, you just have to always plan ahead. You know, there's times where I'll just bring extra content because I'm like, just in case, you never know. But it's important to, you know, going through those what if scenarios. You know, David, I mean, man, that I can only imagine what it's like for, you know, trains and helicopters and all that kind of stuff to have to deal with. And, you know, there's so many moving pieces to that to figure out. But there's, you know, in terms of tips, to be more tangible there, you know, I would recommend, you know, setting down, you know, not only going through your schedule, like figuring out what's your schedule, you know, point by point, you know, and understand when are people arriving, when are they leaving, when does the client expect everyone to be there. You know, having a call sheet is huge. Having even a Google template to share with your crew or even the client so that everyone's on the same page is huge. Because many times you're thinking through a million things, you know, in a day, and the client doesn't understand it, or the crew doesn't know what you're thinking. And so it's good to have that in a document maybe not in super detail, but at least down on paper so that everyone can reference it and understand. And if they have questions, they'll ask you.
If I could just add something as well, I think asking the right questions at the right time is really good. So trying to anticipate problems is great. Trying to fix them before they become a problem is even better. So just as a continuation to that thought, there's many times when, like to use the DIT example, if I'm hiring a camera crew, I don't know if they have that covered. It would be me doing my due diligence and getting ahead of it to say, hey, so what's the plan for, managing the data?
Yep.
Because lots of times people aren't thinking about things they don't think they're supposed to cover, or they just haven't thought about. So just asking the right questions at the right time can go a long way towards, fixing a problem before it happens.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes from experience, because a lot of times you don't know what you don't know, and you try your best to do what you know with what you have. And then as Matt was saying, as you get experience, you learn what some of those fires are, or things you can anticipate better next time. So definitely taking notes on experiences is very helpful. What do you guys do for situations that you don't have experience with? I'm trying to softball a question to you on this one. Where for something that's new and you don't know, what's your plan for trying to make that manageable, so that you don't kill a budget or time? What do you guys do in those situations where something's new for you?
Are you referring to someone who's new to the industry, say like your audience, or are you referring to a new project that maybe we as producers don't have as much experience in? Like what topic are you referring to?
Sure. It's kind of both, because I think the application of what could be done would be similar in both situations. So for example, let's say, Matt, if you had a project come up that had trains and helicopters, and you haven't done that before, which would be the same situation a lot of people are that are new to the industry. There's just a whole lot of things
Sure.
they haven't done before. So
I just
think
call up David.
You just call it. Okay. So finding someone who has the experience is a great advice.
Yep.
I did that. I had a project that was bigger than I've ever worked on before, and I had never budgeted that high for something. And so I did. I made some phone calls to producers. David was one of them. And I said, hey, I know you have some experience specifically in this. What are your thoughts? So yeah, getting input from people who do know is huge. Are there other things in working with a budget and resources? How do you plan contingency? How do you plan for the unknown?
Well, I'll give it a shot. Well, first off, the unknown is going to happen, so you should plan for it. And I think that's a big part of it right there. Some people really get thrown for a loop when something doesn't go as planned. It's like, I'm sorry, you should have been planning on that. So I think that's a big part of it. Just understand that that's going to happen. When I'm thinking about a project, I'm trying to have everything that I can control be as squared away as possible to give the flexibility where we need it. Sometimes that's creatively, sometimes that's because something doesn't go as planned. And the other thing is, when something happens you're not expecting, try to keep the ball rolling. So don't get stuck and frozen by it, but just think, okay, we need to solve this problem. How does that problem impact my day? And if possible, keep your day going. Give people something to do moving forward while you're solving the problem. Lots of times people kind of put everything on pause to solve the problem, and it doesn't necessarily need to be put on pause. If you have two cameras and one camera's not working, that doesn't mean you can't film. Unless you're doing some explosion where you absolutely need all your cameras, keep filming with the camera you have. Or, like, it's just an example. This actually happened to me. I got on set one day and it was 3 hours into the day, and I was asking how we were doing. 3 hours into the day, I'm expecting we've gotten something. They said, well, we haven't gotten first shot up yet. And I said, whoa, say what? And immediately I'm like, what's happening? They said, well, one of our cameras isn't ready. And I said, how many cameras do we have? They said 2. I said, and why haven't we gotten a shot off yet? And I just, didn't need an answer. That was, just rhetorical. So I think that's something that's important. Keep the ball rolling while you're solving the problem. Try to keep things in focus. Yeah, well, I'll just leave it at that. I'll let you say something, Matt.
Sure. I would, going back to more in terms of the pre-pro side of things, I think what David said there was perfect. I don't want to touch any more of that. But in terms of pre-pro, like I can think of an example where I've had projects where they're animation gigs, and I don't do animation. I hire those guys to do it. And so, I've got a list of guys that I reach out to on those type of productions. And, it's like, okay, guys, here's the client's expectations. Here's some inspirational, links to stuff they like. Here's what I, as a creative director, am wanting to suggest to them. What does that look like? Talk with me in terms of cost, in terms of, schedules, things like that. And so I'll do my research on that end. And, when it's an environment that I'm not as familiar with, like I can think of one project where it didn't work out, but it was going to be a 3D medical piece, and animation. So it's like, I don't do animation for the medical field that's 3D, but I know guys that can. And so I had to do my due diligence of working with them and talking with them and researching, being okay, guys, so what does this look like? I understand there's so many moving parts here, but let's help me understand where you're coming from, what you would need in order to make this happen. And I think it comes back to, anyone that is, very well off in terms of, being a CEO or being some type of man. They know how to delegate and they know how to hire the right people. I think of, I've read the Art of the Deal, by Donald Trump, in terms of, he hired the right people to make the project happen. He didn't know everything, but he hired the right people who were extremely specialized in each different job. And that's where you can be successful. If you can manage professionals, if you can steer them and give them a vision, that's huge. But doing your research beforehand can help in terms of navigating waters to where you aren't as familiar as somebody else.
Yeah, I've heard it said that like 50 to 90% of a good director is casting, and by the same token, 50 to 90% of a good producer is getting the right people on the team. So I'm hearing, let me boil down some takeaways here, is that if you don't know what to do, call someone who does, hire someone who does, or talk to the people you think you want to hire and get information from them first. So find the people who do know and talk to them before you start committing to things. How much of that type of due diligence do you guys do before committing to a budget, or developing a budget? And that might even, for a narrative, it almost even seems, I guess sometimes people come to you and say, I have X amount of money, can we do it for this amount? A lot of times there can be situations where we say, here's something we want to do, how much does it cost, and can we raise the money? How far do you go as producers? When do you start committing to certain amounts of budgets, and how do you know when you can commit to that?
Dave, you want to speak to it?
Sure. For me, I don't want to promise something I can't deliver on. And I think it's important, like Matt was talking about earlier, to set expectation. So I think you have to understand a project before you can do that. So if you don't understand it yet, I would say do some research before you commit to something. Nobody wants to be in a situation where they say, oh yeah, absolutely, we can do that. We can do that. Oh yeah, you only have $500. No problem. I'll use, people will come to me and they'll say, hey, can I make a feature film for fill in the blank, 50,000, 100,000, 500,000? I say, absolutely. But somehow people switch the, can I make a feature film for this, to can I make any feature film for this? And it's like, well, no, of course you can't make any feature film for that. So, you just have to really understand the project, I would say, and then figure out what's needed, and then, have that conversation.
And I would add too, in terms of the corporate space, like you do this so long that you start having projects that you can refer back to, like, okay, this is very similar to what I did for this client, what I did for that client, and you already know your numbers. I hope that you know them, or at least that you've saved them in a spreadsheet or something to where you can go back. Because the last thing I want to do, because I've found this over the years, where I would get so tired of reaching out to guys like, okay, what's your rate? what's this, what's that? And it's like, no, just, I have a list of just, typical rates that I already know what's going to cost for my guys, my go-to guys. And then that way I can come to them and say, okay, hey, I've got project X. Are you available? Here's the budget I have for it. If it's like 3 years later, I'm not going to try to hire them for the same budget I did 3 years ago. That'd be terrible. But, it's just basically, I want to do my best to do as much work up front before I come to them and say, hey, here's the project. Let's work together. Because what I hate doing as a producer is I hate having empty promises. Like, hey, we've got a project in 2 months. I would love to have you come on board. What's your availability? They get their hopes up and they're like, you know what? The client decided not to do the project. Like that happens all the time. And the last thing I want to do is have to go call up my crew and say, oh, for the 5th time, this project isn't happening,
Yeah. Yeah. Having the ducks in a row to, before committing to things. I think Proverbs has a lot to say about people that promise clouds and wind without rain, is someone who can't deliver on things. There's other ones as well. People that don't follow through on what they say they can do and accomplish. Proverbs does not speak highly of that. So yeah, again, I think it's, I have found it helpful to talk to people that do know or do have the experience. The other thing is if there's ever a question, I just budget a little higher than what I'm like, well, it might be between this range and I'm just not sure. And they have to have a number now. I'll just quote it higher than what I think, just to try to give myself some space. That when I do make some of those phone calls to say, hey, what are the real numbers of what's this really looking like? If it's dramatically different, then I'll have to come back to a client, and that's always awkward. So you try to avoid that, but try to budget high enough to give yourself some space to work in there and say, okay, we can still make this work, make this happen. And it's a little bit of contingency, a little bit of padding, a little bit of space to work with, which also allows for some of the unplanned stuff. If everything still comes in exactly what I was expecting, I still have a little bit of room to work with some of the unknown stuff that pops up. There's just there's still money that goes out that you weren't planning for. So I would say don't plan a budget to the absolute dollar. Things just don't work that tightly. You need a little bit of room in there to work.
I would say too, John Clay, that this is a tip that I would give everyone that I always do when I talk with clients is that I say, this type of project starts at X. Because that way they realize, okay, it could go way up depending on how many locations they want, depending on where they want to film, depending on, what are the assets in the end that they want, do they want to own the foot? I mean, there's so many different moving parts. That way the expectation is, okay, it's not lower, that they understand it right away that, okay, say for example, this project is, I'll say 50,000, boom. It starts there and goes up. That way, if they're thinking 3,000, they're going to be scared out of their mind. They won't talk to me again, or it's like, okay, let's scale back the scope. Let's understand maybe there's a miscommunication and we need to talk more. But I always like to throw out, because I've done enough projects that typically I can give the client here's where it starts at least, and it goes up from there. But yeah, I never like to come back to the client and say, oh, by the way, that actually is double or triple the price. That's never a position you want to be in.
Awesome. Becky has a question for us here on the live stream. How close to the project do you get your crew together? Do you have department heads hire their own crew? So it's kind of 2 questions. First question, how close to the project do you get your crew together? And I'm sure that depends on the project, but maybe David, if you want to take that on first.
Yeah, so for me, that's pretty easy. Once we have a budget actually present, not just promised, I never hire a crew or even say, hey, I'm looking at these dates. Are you available? Until the budget's in place, especially for feature. But just in general, because of like what Matt was saying, you don't want to call people up a bunch of times and say, oh yeah, actually that got moved or that got canceled or whatever. So the second part to that is knowing your dates. I mean, until I have dates, it's very hard to lock somebody in. So usually it's a 2-step process for me. As soon as I have a rough idea of dates and I think things are squared away, I'll contact my key people and just say, hey, this is kind of on the horizon. It's not a done deal yet, but just checking availability. And then as soon as I have the budget locked in, as soon as I have dates or really close, then I definitely want to lock in my people as soon as possible, because most of the time, if I wait till last minute, somebody else has them. So, you know, as soon as possible, as soon as you know.
That is so true.
Yeah, having money in hand is really important. I also check availability just to see if if I have to go talk to somebody else and I might have to get something more expensive. Sometimes I'll do very loose, you know, availability stuff. But I had people check with me all the time. And to me, it's pretty. If you're new to the industry, the fact that people call and ask if you're available, say the project changed, like you got to get used to that one, because that just happens a lot. And that's not anything special or weird to you. But yeah, having money in hand is a huge piece of getting a project off the ground for sure. Do you, and Matt, I'll refine the questions, clarify the question and pitch to you here is, do you bring in different people in the crew at different points, or are you booking everybody at the same time?
Do you want David to ask or answer that one, or me?
Yeah, I'll let you go first on that one.
Okay. So I would say I can bring people in at different points of the production, but as a producer, this is just, maybe it's my OCD, but I want to have everything lined up. I want to know exactly who I have as the editor, who I have is my crew on set, who, you know, just whatever it may be in every step of the way. I want it done on paper and everyone's confirmed before anything else moves forward, because I want to know that I have them locked in. I don't want to get through the shoot. We've shot amazing footage with everyone, and then 2 weeks later, like, oh, you know what? That editor that I wanted is no longer available because I didn't line them up. You know, so I prefer, once I have a contract, once I have, you know, payment in place, once I have some hard dates in place, I instantly just line people up and sniping them off because I want them on the project.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I know you bring in pre-production people, you know, it's going to be a little different than production. You know, different pieces of the crew will come in at different times on narrative or feature film or even bigger projects for sure. But yeah, I think David's point of, you know, when there's money, you can't lock people in until you have money. And so that's a huge piece of that. But Andrew, I think we had one other question we wanted to get to as we're starting to wrap up here on our hour.
Yeah.
What's one of our last questions here?
Yeah. So another question, which was a good question, is just talking about long distance producing. So how do you find, so there's a couple aspects to this. I'm just going to list some of the things and you guys can kind of talk about this concept. But so first of all, tips for producing from films at a distance when you aren't able to visit locations ahead of time or as far out of time as you would like. Then also how to find contacts for local crew, locations, extras, and stuff like that. So basically it's the whole concept of producing when you aren't in the actual same place. So I don't know, maybe Matt, if you want to tackle that first.
Sure. Okay. So in terms of finding local crew, there are plenty of Facebook groups out there that you can find local crew. If that doesn't work, I tend to, so my thought process goes through, one, can I hire people that I want? Can I fly them to the location? That's more expensive, but there are certain individuals that I want for sure because I know we work really well together. And I know that no matter what stressful situation we'll go through, we'll get through it, and I can trust them and I can rely on them to make an amazing product. If I want local crew, I'll reach out to people I know and say, hey, do you know anybody in this city? I'm looking for this position in this city. If that doesn't bring anything, there are some Facebook groups I'm a part of that I'll reach out to as well. And that always, I mean, there's plenty of DPs, there's plenty of editors, there's gaffers, there's audio guys everywhere across the US that you can find, and like I've done it with, rental houses, for finding gear, and people are connected and they're more than happy to share contacts and referrals. So that's kind of the mental process I go through in terms of finding people. In terms of locations, a lot of the productions I'm on, you see the location the night before. You fly in and you check it out, and then you go get dinner. And it's just that's corporate content. What I try to do as a producer, I'll have the client or the agency or both, whoever I'm talking with, say, hey, I want to see photos. Send me photos of that location so that I can share them with my DP and gaffer, and we can start kind of thinking through how we're going to light this scene or where we may point the camera, that kind of thing. but I'm trying to get as much information from the client beforehand, before we even show up. Because while showing up and seeing the site beforehand, the night before can work, it's always helpful to have a couple weeks notice with my crew to be like, okay, here's what we're working with. And then that way we can start talking about gear. We can talk about how we're going to light the scene. It just helps everything be a lot more smooth. And back to what David was saying earlier in terms of anticipating issues that may come up.
David, any thoughts on producing something from a distance?
So find a fixer, find somebody local if you can afford it. We've talked a little bit about it earlier, but yeah, I mean, somebody that's connected, somebody that knows people, because, it's not just a location or a crew member, but what happens when you get into that pinch and you're looking to solve the problem and you don't know where to source something. They're going to know the people that are local, that kind of thing. So try to find somebody if you can. It's just a huge asset. To the point, if you can't be on location, but you need to see the location ahead of time, try to get somebody that can snap some pictures for you, take a video, all that kind of stuff. Maybe even do a live video with you where you can look at the stuff. I've many times done locations work, and I can't tell you how many times I'll be looking for a specific thing the client wants. We pull it up on Google Maps, and they're like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I want. And I'm like, really? You just want to film it on Google Maps? Because just because it looks like this on Google Maps does not mean it looks like that in person, And in fact, most times it doesn't. So, don't rely on Street View or some topographical map or some picture that's 8 years old. We've all probably seen those pictures of fancy tourist destinations with no tourists there. I've been to China. I can attest to the fact if you go to the Great Wall, all you see is people. Yes, there's a wall there somewhere. So I think it's just important to really, as much as possible, think, okay, if I'm not local, if I can't be there, how do I get as close as possible to being there and being local to try to get the information you can get.
Good. One more question, second part of the live question I wanted to specifically pitch to David, because I think, because I think, Matt, when we're doing corporate stuff, a lot of times the smaller projects, this may not apply to that, but the question is, do you have department heads hire their own crew? Which again, I know when it's small enough, you're going to usually just bring in the group yourself, but on the larger narrative type stuff, David, where do you draw the line between hiring everybody or letting the department head to hire their team?
So as much as possible, I try to keep the responsibility structure intact. So if I'm going to hold my DP responsible for the picture, I need to allow him the flexibility to bring in the guys he's comfortable with working with. And then if he brings in a particular gaffer, I want that gaffer to be able to work with the guys he's comfortable working with. It goes back to that whole trust thing. You gain so much by just working with people that you're used to working with. So where that breaks down is when the DP is willing to work for half of his usual rate, but all his guys are not, and you're working on a really small budget, all of a sudden, he can't bring his guys on. So what I do in that situation is I'll have people that I know when I made the budget. It's like, okay, I know I can always bring a group in for these rates. So when I bring somebody on, I always give them the option. But if they get stuck and they don't have people, it's also important for me to have some options for them. I'll say, well, here's some good options, but I still put it back to them, still leave it up to them. Because as a producer, I don't want to take on the responsibility of the gaffer. I want the gaffer to take on that responsibility. So I need to trust him enough to give him, some flexibility. It's like, it's that old idea of tying somebody's arms behind their back and saying, hey, do your job. So you want to give them all the possibilities they can have. So yeah, I would say in almost all scenarios, let your guys bring on who they want to bring on. And if you're not happy with those guys, maybe you picked the wrong guy to start with. And so usually I use a structure. If I have a director, I found out what AD he wants to work with, what DP he wants to work with. If I can bring him on, I bring him on. And I'm not going to hire an AC before the DP, it doesn't make any sense. Hire the DP, figure out who your camera operators are. They figure out who their ACs are. The ACs figure out who their seconds are. You know what I mean? And they'll kind of go structuring that with you.
Good. Yeah. Thank you. That's very helpful. One of our favorite questions for wrapping up these panels is any recent pay the bills projects that doesn't necessarily land on the curation of Instagram or the portfolio. Just the thought that a lot of times what we see on social media is just the best of the best, and that's not necessarily an accurate representation all the time of what it takes to stay in the industry. Do either of you guys, I'll let either one of you speak up, take this one first. Anything you're willing to share or can share, or just the type of work sometimes that comes through to pay the bills?
Sure, yeah, I'll speak to this real quick. I would say for me, so I run a branding and strategy company as well. And we just about 2 weeks ago finished a project in Alabama for a contractor that builds luxury custom homes. So when I'm saying luxury, it's, $1 to $4 million homes, very custom. So I still utilize my producer, creative director role hat, there as well. So that's something that I have going on the side because I'm an entrepreneur at heart. So that's going on there. I also am project managing some other productions for some other production companies because that's something that I can give of my time as a freelance project manager. So, when things are slower on my end, I can still utilize my services as a contractor that way.
Nice. Good. Any thoughts, David?
I don't approach things in a very normal way, I guess, but most of my projects that I'm doing that aren't as well known don't pay the bills. So it's actually, I spend a lot of time helping with the Christian Worldview Film Festival. I do a lot of different things. I'm helping advise several ministries that are making short films in other countries, different things like that. They absolutely don't pay the bills, but I don't view myself or the client as my source for income either. I think of God as kind of helping manage that, Christian, so that flows naturally for me. So for me, I don't view it that way. I view it as like, hey, I'm working on his time, so he helps me pay the bills. So whatever he wants me to do, whenever he wants me to do, it's fine. I've power washed houses. I've sold stuff on eBay. It's like, to me, it's like, hey, there's no shame or no problem in doing whatever's set before you. I think, just hard work and good character values are going to get you where you want to go eventually. Proverbs says that as well. So, you just be faithful with where you are and do what you got to do, and it's all good.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. The last question here is any recommended resource for growth. This could be books, podcasts, courses, training, conferences, scripture passages, whatever you guys want to recommend to the group, whether it relates to producing directly or maybe just personal development type of resource. Any thoughts on something you guys have either recently found helpful or just go-to recommendations? It's a pretty broad, open-ended question for you guys there. Anything you want to recommend to the group?
Yeah, I would say in terms of podcasting, so I don't go out and try to find producer podcasting. The podcasting shows I listen to, there are many different topics I just have interest in, and I've never even tried to look for a producer podcast. That would be interesting. But I listen to the Gary Vee show just because there's some things that he speaks to there that are very applicable to any type of position you're in, just in terms of working hard, to staying humble, to being kind, and just some key things that you can use in no matter what position you're in. I have stumbled upon a new one called Theory of Three. It's a podcast that is actually a crew of mine down in St. Louis that I hire. They just talk about anything film production wise. So anything what's going on in Hollywood to local productions that they do. They're three brothers, and it's kind of comical to hear them talk about stuff. So I get a kick out of just hearing from their perspective on different aspects there. But what some books that and Dave, I'm curious if you're a reader at all. But I found that building a story brand is huge. How to Win Friends and Influence People is a good one. Go Givers Sell More, getting back to more of thinking of others and being generous and kind, whether it's with your time or your resources. E-Myth is a good one. And then The Win Without Pitching Manifesto. So those are some books that I would recommend. Just they're not producer books, but it's just overall business books in terms of how to conduct yourself as a professional.
Yeah. Great. It's a great list. Thank you. Go ahead, David.
Really good options there. I like educating myself on leadership related things, really diving deep into that. And I've been going through a pastoral training course at my church and found how many things are actually applicable to the producing side. Creativity Inc. is a fun book that I like. And, just again, to some of the ideas we've talked about, I like reading Proverbs a lot. And I find that I'll think about lots of different Proverbs that I've just read. I got into the habit of reading the proverb for every day of the month. So, if it's the 22nd, read Proverbs 22. And usually I'll find some thought that's just good for the day or for the week or whatever will happen. Good name is to be desired above riches, or just whatever. That's the one that comes to mind right now. So, just those thoughts. I think if you just get in the habit, though, of reading a book or educating yourself in some way, continuing that process, watch these just podcasts. Really, I think if you continue to just keep your mind busy on learning, that's really the key. So just keep reading, keep listening. Don't assume you know it all.
That one.
Yeah, that's great, guys. Thank you again so much for taking time. I did want to give a shout out. I know Matt has, you still doing the freelance kit, the filmmaker freelance kit?
I am, yes, correct.
Yeah. Fantastic. I know Andy and both have availed ourselves of those resources. They're documents for filmmakers that have been looked over from a contractual and legal standpoint. Highly recommend those. It's called Freelance Kit. Be sure to check those out. We've used those in our project, so that's helpful, especially from a producing standpoint where there's a lot of paperwork and documents. I highly recommend checking out the Freelance Kit. Well, we're at time, so we're going to wrap this up. Thank you all again for watching live. Again, this has been part of Motion University, and I do want to say that we have a fall course coming up. If you're looking for more filmmaking training, you can go to motionuniversity.org to learn more about that, how to build a career, not just a hobby. And thank you guys for tuning in, and we will see you next time. All right, and we're muted.
Woo! Good job, guys.
Woo! Yeah. Well, thank you, guys. Again, I'm looking weird over here, so let me put you guys over here so I can see.
No, that's fine.
Hey,
Hopefully.